April 1945, Western Germany. A former training ground now wrapped in barbed wire and silence. The war has not ended yet, but it is already hollowing out from the inside. The air smells of damp earth and unwashed uniforms. Wooden barracks stand unevenly, hurriedly built, their walls thin against the cold. Inside the enclosure, German women sit or stand in loose clusters. Auxiliaries, clerks, nurses, the refugees caught in retreat. Their coats hang heavy on their frames, no longer fitting the bodies beneath them. An American soldier steps forward with a crate. He is not dramatic, he is tired. He opens it and reaches inside, pulling out small tins and packets. Routine movements, standard issue. He hands one over. Inside the tin is a thick brown paste. The women stare at it. Some lift the lid cautiously. The smell is unfamiliar, nutty, rich, almost sweet. One woman touches it with her finger, then hesitates. Food has not looked like this in years. Food has been thin, grey, measured. This is dense, heavy, caloric. Eat, the guard says, without emphasis. They do not yet understand what this moment represents. But the war for them is about to change shape, not through gunfire, but through a spoon. And to understand why, the world that led to this exchange must first come into focus. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe had entered its final, exhausted phase. German forces were no longer maneuvering for advantage. They were reacting, retreating westward under pressure from the Red Army in the east and the combined weight of American, British, and Canadian armies advancing from the west. Entire divisions were dissolving before surrender orders could even be transmitted. Roads were choked with refugees, wounded soldiers, and administrative units trying to outrun a collapse that had already overtaken them. Food, more than ammunition, defined this stage of the war inside Germany. The Allied strategic bombing campaign had not only targeted factories and rail yards, it had quietly dismantled the food distribution system that sustained the civilian population. Rail lines that once carried grain from eastern territories were severed. Refrigeration facilities were destroyed. Slaughterhouses stood idle, not for lack of animals, but for lack of transport, electricity, and manpower. By late 1944, Germany's rationing system, already strained, was breaking down unevenly, favoring frontline combat units while civilians survived on diminishing allocations. Official civilian rations in many regions fell below subsistence levels. Bread was adulterated with fillers. Meat became rare. Fats, essential for calories and warmth, nearly vanished. Women, the elderly, and children bore the brunt of this scarcity. Many German women employed in auxiliary military roles, signals, administration, medical services, were still technically attached to the war effort. Yet they lived with the same hunger as civilians, often worse as units retreated and supply lines disintegrated. On the other side of the front, the American war machine functioned differently. The United States entered the war with industrial depth unmatched by any other nation. By 1944, American logistics had matured into a system that could feed millions of soldiers daily across oceans and continents. The Quartermaster Corps operated with scientific precision. Calories were counted, proteins measured, fats calculated not as luxury, but as fuel. The goal was not survival, but sustained combat effectiveness. Peanut butter was a product of that system, high in fat and protein, non-perishable, cheap to produce at scale, resistant to spoilage. For American planners, it was an efficient solution to a mathematical problem: how to keep soldiers moving, thinking, and fighting. By the later years of the war, peanut butter appeared regularly in Kate rations and C rations, the packaged in tins or waxed cartons, consumed casually by soldiers who often complained about monotony rather than scarcity. This imbalance between collapse and abundance was not immediately visible at the front lines. Combat compressed experience, but it became unmistakable in the rear areas, in holding camps, processing centers, and improvised prisoner enclosures established as German units surrendered en masse. By March and April of 1945, the U.S. Army was capturing tens of thousands of prisoners each week. Among them were not only male soldiers, but women attached to military organizations. Evacuees swept up in retreat, and displaced civilians who no longer had anywhere to go. The Geneva Convention provided a framework for their treatment, but the reality depended on logistics, available supplies, and the speed at which chaos unfolded. American doctrine required that prisoners be fed adequately. Not generously, adequately. The easiest way to do this was not to create separate food systems, but to issue modified versions of existing rations. What was routine for the captor became extraordinary for the captive. And so, in dozens of camps across Western Germany, unfamiliar foods began to appear: white bread, canned meat, powdered milk, chocolate, and sometimes, without explanation, a brown paste that did not resemble anything the women had known before the war. This was not an act of mercy, nor a psychological tactic. It was administrative efficiency. Yet when abundance meets deprivation, even routine actions acquire meaning. The women holding those tins did not see logistics. They saw density, calories, survival, something solid in a world that had been hollowed out. To understand how this moment landed so deeply, it is necessary to look more closely at who these women were, how they had lived, and what hunger had already taught them, long before the lid was opened. By 1945, German women were no longer peripheral to the war. They had been absorbed into it. As male labor vanished into the front lines and casualty lists lengthened, women filled administrative offices, hospitals, communications centers, and logistics depots. Some wore uniforms. Others wore armbands or carried papers that bound them to military units in retreat. Many were young. Some were barely trained. Almost all were exhausted. Their relationship with food had changed long before captivity. From 1939 onward, German rationing was strict, centralized, and heavily propagandized. Early shortages were framed as patriotic sacrifice. But as the war turned against Germany, the system became increasingly punitive in effect, if not in intent. Rations were reduced repeatedly. Replacement foods appeared: ersatz coffee, synthetic fats, bread bulked with potato flour or cellulose. Calories declined steadily, especially for those not classified as essential workers. By 1944, daily fat intake for many civilians had fallen to a fraction of pre-war levels. Hunger was not sudden starvation, it was a slow arithmetic. Each week meant a little less strength, a little more cold, a little more weight lost without noticing. For women still working in military-adjacent roles, long hours and physical labor accelerated the decline. Illness spread easily in underheated quarters. Menstrual cycles stopped. Hair thinned. Skin dulled. Hunger rewrote the body quietly. When Allied forces advanced, these women moved with collapsing units or fled on foot with civilians. Some were captured in organized surrenders. Others were detained at roadblocks, rail stations, or makeshift checkpoints. Captivity was not always announced. It simply happened when movement stopped. The camps that held them were not uniform. Some were repurposed barracks. Others were fields enclosed with wire. Administration focused on speed, not comfort. Names were recorded when possible, categories assigned loosely. The distinction between prisoner of war, internee, and displaced person often blurred, especially in the chaotic final weeks. What remained consistent was food policy. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners were to receive rations equivalent to those of the detaining power's own troops, adjusted for captivity. In practice, this meant that American-issued food, already prepared, packaged and stocked, was distributed with minimal modification. The goal was to prevent disease, unrest, and logistical complications. Hunger made people weak. Weak people required care. Care consumed resources. For the women, the contrast was immediate. American rations were dense, compact. Each item had weight, not just in the hand, but in promise. Bread that did not crumble into dust. Canned meat that smelled like meat. Sugar that was not measured in pinches. And then there was peanut butter. Few German civilians had encountered it before the war. Peanuts were imported and uncommon. Ground nut pastes were not part of European diets. The texture alone was disorienting, thick, resistant, almost adhesive. It did not pour, it did not slice, it clung. Some women mistook it for animal feed. Others thought it was medicinal. The color suggested fat, but the smell was wrong, too rich, too foreign. There were moments of suspicion. Hunger does not erase caution, it sharpens it. American guards rarely explained. They had no reason to. To them, this was fuel, something eaten standing up from a spoon or finger without ceremony. Complaints among soldiers focused on repetition, not flavor. Peanut butter was something you endured. For women who had lived on watery soups and thin bread, endurance took a different form. The first taste did not always bring pleasure. Some found it overwhelming. The fat coated the mouth. The sweetness felt unnatural after years of deprivation. But the body responded immediately. Warmth spread. Energy returned in small, unmistakable pulses. This was not generosity. It was policy colliding with deprivation. And in that collision, meaning emerged where none was intended. A spoonful of paste became evidence, not of kindness, but of imbalance so vast it could not be ignored. The women began to understand that the war they had lived inside was not the same war their captors had fought. That realization, once formed, did not remain confined to food. It reshaped how they saw power, defeat, and survival itself, an internal shift that unfolded across many perspectives, each revealing a different truth about the same moment. For the women, hunger was no longer an emergency. It had become a condition. There were no dramatic collapses, no pleading gestures when food appeared. Instead, there was calculation. How much? How often? How long it would last? Hunger taught restraint long before captivity ever did. When the peanut butter was issued, reactions were subdued. Some women ate immediately. Others saved it, wrapping the tin carefully, planning to stretch its contents across days. The body, trained by scarcity, resisted indulgence. Even when the paste stuck to the spoon, even when it coated the tongue, the instinct was to stop before fullness arrived. What lingered was not taste, but density. This food did not disappear in minutes. It stayed. Hours passed without the familiar weakness returning. Hands stopped trembling. The cold felt less sharp. Hunger momentarily loosened its grip. Shame also surfaced quietly. Being fed by the enemy carried a psychological weight. Years of propaganda did not vanish with surrender. Accepting food felt like confirmation of failure. Not only military, but moral. Yet hunger left no space for pride. Survival required compliance. In this space between necessity and humiliation, the women adjusted. They did not speak much about the food. They noted its effects. Hunger had trained them to observe the body closely. Peanut butter became dated energy in, weakness out. The American soldier's angle, Routine without meaning for the American Guards. There was nothing remarkable about the exchange. By April 1945, many had been on campaign for months. Some since Normandy, others since Italy or North Africa. Feeding prisoners was part of the job, no different from guarding roads or checking papers. Rations arrived by truck. Crates were opened. Items were distributed. The same food they ate themselves, sometimes with minor adjustments. Peanut butter was common, a reliable source of calories that did not require heating or preparation. Soldiers joked about it, complained about it. Some traded it away when possible. There was little awareness of how it was received. American soldiers came from a civilian culture already familiar with abundance. Even during wartime rationing at home, food scarcity in the United States never approached European levels. Many guards had grown up eating peanut butter as children. Its presence in a war zone felt normal. This normalization created distance. The act of feeding did not register as power. It was administration. Prisoners were to be kept alive, healthy enough to move work or be transferred. Food served that purpose. Nothing more. Some soldiers noticed the women's reactions, the hesitation, the careful eating, but interpreted it as unfamiliarity, not deprivation. Cultural difference, not hunger. There was no cruelty in this misunderstanding, only absence of shared experience. The moral angle, feeding the enemy, feeding prisoners, carried an unspoken moral tension. The women receiving rations belonged to a nation that had inflicted immense suffering across Europe. American soldiers were aware of liberated camps, civilian casualties, and destroyed cities. Yet policy required humane treatment. The food issued was not symbolic forgiveness. It was obligation. Still, the act carried weight. Feeding someone establishes hierarchy. One eats because another allows it. In this exchange, power was exercised without violence. Control manifested through calories rather than weapons. For some women, this shift was disorienting. The same army that had bombed cities now provided sustenance. The contradiction was difficult to reconcile. It challenged the simplified narratives of good and evil that war encourages. For the Americans, morality was embedded in procedure. Follow regulations. Treat prisoners correctly. Move forward. There was no space for philosophical reflection in a camp holding thousands, where paperwork piled faster than answers. Yet morality does not require intention to exist. It emerges in outcomes. The women were alive, fed, stabilized, not because they were deserving, but because the system demanded it. In that demand, a different kind of victory appeared. Not celebrated, not even named. These overlapping perspectives did not cancel each other out. They layered. Human need met routine action. Moral obligation met logistical efficiency. Together, they formed a moment that could be understood only by turning it slightly, again and again, until other angles came into view. Angles shaped by technology, culture, and the defeated enemy's own reckoning. Peanut butter did not arrive in the camps by accident. It was the result of industrial planning refined over years of global war. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps treated food as a technical problem. How many calories could be delivered per pound? How long an item could survive transport without refrigeration? How it behaved in heat, cold, and humidity. Peanut butter excelled in every category. It required no cooking fuel. It resisted spoilage. Its caloric density was high enough that a small portion could sustain a soldier through hours of exertion. Packed in sealed tins or waxed cartons, it fit neatly into standardized crates, stacked efficiently in trucks, ships, and depots. It was, in logistical terms, elegant. German military logistics, by contrast, had collapsed under sustained pressure. Fuel shortages halted transport. Allied bombing fractured rail networks. Food production existed, but distribution failed. The difference between having food and delivering it became decisive. In captivity, that difference was embodied in a spoonful of paste. For the women, this was their first direct encounter with American logistical power, not through tanks or aircraft, but through nutrition. The war revealed itself not as ideology or heroism, but as infrastructure. The side that could move food reliably had already won. The cultural angle. A foreign taste in a familiar defeat. Food carries memory and identity. The unfamiliarity of peanut butter was not merely sensory, it was cultural displacement made edible. German wartime food had become thin, bitter, and repetitive. Soup stretched with water. Bread darkened with substitutes. Fat, when available, was saved carefully, almost ceremonially. Peanut butter ignored these habits. It demanded no preparation, no stretching, no sharing across a pot. It was individual, immediate, dense. Some women spread it on bread. Others ate it directly. A few mixed it with whatever else they had, trying to domesticate the taste. But it resisted adaptation. It remained foreign. That foreignness mattered. It reinforced the reality of defeat more effectively than flags or uniforms. This was not just another army occupying their land. It was a different world arriving intact, complete with its own habits, comforts, and assumptions. The taste lingered long after the tin was empty. For some women, it became permanently associated with captivity. For others, it marked the moment they realized the war was irreversibly lost, not because of military failure, but because their society could no longer provide even the basics of life. The enemy's perspective. Defeat measured in calories. Defeat is often imagined as surrender ceremonies or official announcements. For the women in the camps, it was quieter. It was felt in the body. Eating American food meant acknowledging dependency. The state that had once rationed, controlled, and promised endurance was gone. Its structures had dissolved. In their place stood a system that fed them without asking who they were or what they believed. This was not humiliation in the theatrical sense. No one mocked them. No speeches were made. The humiliation was internal, rooted in comparison. The realization that the enemy's ordinary was more nourishing than their own, necessary. Some women resisted the implications. They told themselves it was temporary, that Germany would rebuild, that scarcity would end. Others understood immediately that the war had exposed a deeper imbalance, one that ideology could not overcome. The peanut butter did not convert loyalties. It did not inspire gratitude in any simple form. But it did alter perception. Power became tangible. It could be tasted, swallowed, digested. This internal reckoning unfolded unevenly, shaped by individual experience and memory. Yet it converged toward a single truth: the war was no longer being fought with weapons. It had moved into the realm of endurance, administration, and survival. That shift reached its sharpest point, not in speeches or battles, but in the moment when the women finally consumed the ration fully, not cautiously, not experimentally, but with acceptance, when eating no longer felt strange, but necessary. That moment, when routine distribution became personal transformation, formed the quiet climax of this story. A turning point without noise, where the war changed not on the map, but inside the people living through its end. The distribution does not change. The guards remain the same. The tins are opened in the same order. What changes is the way the women receive them. In the early days of captivity, peanut butter is handled cautiously. Portions are measured with care. Each spoonful is separated by long pauses, the body waiting to see if it will accept what the mind still questions. Hunger has taught them that unfamiliar food can bring consequences. Then, gradually something shifts. The body begins to respond before the mind has time to argue. Energy arrives without delay. The familiar dizziness does not return. The H behind the eyes fades. Limbs feel heavier, but in a stabilizing way, anchored rather than weakened. Sleep deepens. The constant cold loosens its hold. This is not imagined. It is biochemical. Years of deprivation have left fat reserves depleted. Muscles have thinned. Metabolism has slowed to conserve energy. The sudden introduction of a high-fat, high-protein food alters that balance immediately. The women may not know the science, but they feel the effect with precision. The change is visible. Faces fill slightly. Movements become less tentative. Conversation increases, not in volume, but in length. People stand longer, walk farther. The camp does not become comfortable, but it becomes survivable in a way it had not been before. For the first time in years, hunger is not the dominant thought. This realization unsettles many of them more than hunger ever did. Hunger had been constant, predictable. It demanded obedience. Relief introduces uncertainty. What happens next? How long will this last? What does it mean to be sustained by those you were taught to fear? Some women stop rationing their peanut butter, not because they trust abundance, but because the body insists. The instinct to conserve weakens when immediate need is satisfied. The tin empties faster. There is guilt in that speed, but also relief. Around them, the war continues to collapse. Outside the wire, American columns move eastward. Towns surrender without resistance. White flags appear in windows. German radio broadcasts become erratic. Rumors pass through the camp faster than official information. Hitler is dead. No, he has fled. No one knows for certain. What is certain is this: the world that required hunger no longer exists. In this environment, the act of eating becomes a form of adjustment. Each spoonful reinforces a new reality. The women are no longer surviving under their own system. They are being maintained by another. The guards notice the change, but without interpretation. Health reports improve. Fewer complaints. Less collapse during roll calls. From an administrative standpoint, the camp is stabilizing. That is the objective. For the women, stabilization feels like suspension. They are no longer starving, but they are not free. Their bodies are recovering inside an unresolved future. There is a moment, unrecorded, unremarked, when the peanut butter is no longer strange, when the smell does not prompt hesitation, when the spoon does not pause halfway to the mouth, when eating becomes automatic again. That moment marks the true turning point. Because once food stops being foreign, defeat becomes permanent. The war is no longer something happening around them. It has entered their routines, their digestion, their sleep. The women do not speak of surrender. They speak of tomorrow's distribution, of whether the bread will arrive on time, of how many tins remain in the crate. These are not small concerns. They are the concerns of people who understand that survival now depends on continuity, not resistance. And as the tins are emptied and stacked, as bodies regain strength inside borrowed order, the implications of this quiet transformation begin to spread beyond physiology, beyond the camp, into how power itself is understood in the aftermath of total war. The moment of consumption becomes a mirror. Each spoonful of peanut butter reflects a reality that words cannot yet articulate. Hunger had been a constant companion. Now it retreats, leaving space for awareness. Awareness of who controls life, even in small measures, and of how survival is no longer self-determined. Some women feel a subtle betrayal, not by the Americans, but by their own world. Germany had promised endurance, sacrifice, honor, but it had delivered ration cards, starvation, and the hollow insistence that they persevere without nourishment. The paste, smooth and rich, reveals the absence more sharply than any spoken accusation. Others are quietly relieved. There is gratitude, though complicated, unspoken, layered with shame. They do not thank the guards. They do not express joy. They simply allow the paste to sustain them. It is enough. The body, once fragile, begins to reclaim energy. Muscles regain their tension. Skin flushes with warmth. Even the simple act of standing or walking feels less taxing. Survival, once precarious, becomes tangible. The American soldiers witness these changes without drama. They note improvement in energy levels, fewer fainting spells, and steadier moods. To them, this is the efficiency of supply chains realized. The war is being unwon by logistical superiority, one ration at a time. They rarely pause to consider the psychological effects on the recipients. The recalibration of identity, the quiet collapse of pride, the dawning recognition that power can arrive as sustenance rather than weapon. This recalibration is not merely physical. The women begin to understand the new rules of control. Authority is no longer expressed through propaganda, intimidation, or even ideology. It manifests in the reliability of food, in warmth, in the ability to keep a body alive day after day. The Americans have won not only the battlefield, but the arithmetic of survival. There are no speeches, no salutes, no proclamations of victory. Only routine distribution, the clinking of tin lids, the whisper of spoons against metal. Yet inside that quiet ritual, a transformation is complete. The camp no longer operates under the same hierarchy. Defeat has become embodied. Survival has been reassigned. Across barracks, whispers circulate: the paste is more than food. It is proof. Proof that the enemy has abundance where their own nation has scarcity. Proof that surrender does not always arrive with soldiers' boots or artillery, but with daily calories. Proof that life continues, regardless of ideology, for those willing to accept it. Some resist this realization. A few hoard the tins, guarding the paste, as if by conserving it they could reclaim control. But for most, the body dictates rhythm now. Hunger no longer dictates decisions. Nutrition does. The tiny jars of brown paste have become instruments of adjustment. They reset metabolism, patience, and perception all at once. By the end of the first week, the transformation is visible in every barrack. The women's movements are steadier, their postures more assertive, their eyes less hollow. Small disputes over space or sleeping arrangements fade because energy is no longer entirely consumed by survival. The camp's atmosphere shifts from tense anticipation to cautious stability. And in that stability, the final truth of this turning point emerges. War is not only fought with weapons, but with infrastructure, logistics, and the subtle reshaping of human need. Peanut butter, mundane to the supplier, extraordinary to the recipient, has become a medium of power, quiet, uncelebrated, irreversible. The women are still captives. The world outside remains unstable. Germany lies in ruins. Yet inside, a private revolution has occurred. Their bodies, minds, and perceptions have been recalibrated by a single, seemingly insignificant ration. The act of eating, once mechanical, has become transformative. And this transformation sets the stage for what comes next: the consequences, the records, the aftermath of a war ending not only in armies defeated, but in hunger measured, relieved, and remembered. In the weeks following the distribution of rations, the first signs of recovery became apparent. Health reports, compiled by American medical personnel, recorded measurable changes. Body weight stabilized in many women, fainting and dizziness declined, and minor illnesses related to malnutrition were curtailed. The once fragile prisoners moved with more confidence. Barracks, previously dominated by fatigue and whispered complaints, now echoed with the quiet rhythm of sustained energy. Footsteps, the rustle of blankets, the tapping of utensils. The peanut butter tins, once alien and suspect, were now familiar objects. They served as markers in time, dividing each day into meals, portions, and survival strategies. American logistical routines imposed structure on the camp, unintentionally reshaping the prisoners' perception of order. For many women, this structure became a psychological anchor, a predictable cadence in a world that had been otherwise chaotic for months, even years. Medical officers documented not only physical effects but also emotional responses. They observed subtle shifts, improved morale, reduced anxiety over food scarcity, and tentative social engagement among prisoners. Women began to organize themselves more effectively within the barracks, trading ration portions strategically, conserving supplies, and maintaining hygiene practices with renewed energy. The daily intake of calories had restored more than just the body. It had re-established a sense of control over small but vital aspects of life. Reports emphasized efficiency over emotion. Rationing was described in spreadsheets, caloric calculations, and logistical planning. Yet in the margins, notes revealed human consequences. Prisoners initially suspicious of contents, now consuming willingly, or significant increase in weight among younger women, energy levels stable. Each note, mundane in tone, captured a deeper reality. Survival could now be measured quantitatively, but comprehension of what it represented, the silent power of nourishment, was qualitative, profound, and often unspoken. Simultaneously, American authorities faced practical challenges. Supplies were finite. Transport lines, though superior, were under constant strain. Food distribution had to balance the needs of thousands of prisoners with the advancing army's requirements. Yet the unexpected result was that these women, previously on the edge of collapse, were now physically capable of complying with administrative requirements, roll calls, work assignments, and transfers. The logistical success translated directly into operational stability. Beyond numbers, small, human-scale adjustments became apparent. Women began sharing rations with one another, offering tiny portions as gestures of solidarity. Eating, once a solitary survival act, now carried social dimension. Quiet camaraderie emerged in lines at distribution points, in whispered discussions about taste, quantity, and pacing. The pace became a medium through which community subtly reformed inside captivity, and in doing so, altered the psychological environment of the camp. Yet, even with these improvements, limitations remained stark. Psychological scars from hunger persisted. Habits of caution, thrift, and distrust did not vanish overnight. Some women refused to consume the full portion at once, rationing carefully as if scarcity might return at any moment. Every tin consumed carried the dual weight of relief and unease, a recognition that survival now depended on the enemy's consistency rather than their own society's stability. The immediate aftermath was therefore dual. The body strengthened and the mind adjusted. Hunger receded from acute crisis to a managed variable, while the realization that food could arrive from an external, authoritative source recalibrated internal hierarchies of trust, fear, and dependence. The peanut butter tins, unassuming in size but monumental in effect, had quietly rewritten daily life inside the camp. The experience of receiving American rations, particularly peanut butter, left an imprint that would persist long after the war ended. Memoirs written decades later frequently mention the paste, not as a culinary delight, but as a symbol of survival shock and the quiet power of abundance. For many German women, the memory of the first spoonful remains vivid. The unfamiliar texture, the richness of flavor, the sudden surge of energy after years of near starvation. Hunger, once a constant companion, receded enough to allow reflection and eventually storytelling. Official records confirm the scale of such interventions. Red Cross reports from 1945 describe tens of thousands of female prisoners receiving rations sufficient to prevent malnutrition, related fatalities. American military logs note the efficiency of daily distributions, citing improved health metrics and reduced incidences of illness as measurable outcomes. What the reports cannot fully convey is the psychological shift, the subtle recalibration of authority, trust, and dependency that came with sustained nutrition. The rations became more than food. They became instruments of control, stability, and human dignity restored, if only partially. Oral histories collected in the post-war years reinforce this narrative. Women recalled the initial disbelief, the careful tasting, and the hesitation before fully accepting the tins. Some described laughter mixed with unease, as the brown paste was spread on bread or eaten directly. Others spoke of gratitude tinged with shame, grateful for nourishment, yet uneasy at relying on those they had been taught to consider enemies. Across accounts, the recurring theme is consistent: peanut butter, mundane to the distributor, extraordinary to the recipient, became a small but enduring emblem of the war's human dimension. Long-term consequences extended beyond the camps. These women carried memories of abundance and deprivation into post-war Germany, shaping perceptions of American occupation. The disparity between their lived experience and pro-war expectations colored narratives of defeat and survival. For some, the act of being fed by the other offered a complicated moral reflection. Survival did not require approval, heroism, or ideological alignment. It required acceptance of sustenance, trust in process, and the surrender of pride. Academic studies of POWs experiences later emphasized this effect. Scholars highlighted that post-war adjustment often relied on such encounters with reliable, sufficient nutrition. Physical recovery preceded psychological recovery. In many cases, the simple act of feeding became a cornerstone of resilience. The American rations, by meeting this need efficiently, influenced long-term adaptation to post-war life, both materially and emotionally. Ultimately, these women's experiences illustrate a broader truth about the war's human cost and its resolution. Victory is measured not solely in territory captured or battles won, but in the ability to restore basic needs, to stabilize lives previously unmoored, and to create moments of control and predictability amid chaos. The peanut butter tins, ordinary within the supply chain of an advanced military force, became extraordinary precisely because they reasserted order, nutrition, and continuity in the lives of those who had known deprivation for years. As the last crates were distributed and the first records filed, the war did not end in dramatic ceremonies for these women. Its conclusion was quieter, measured in meals eaten, bodies recovering, and minds tentatively accepting that life could continue without immediate threat of starvation. That quiet, steady aftermath, rooted in logistics, human endurance, and the unforeseen power of a simple ration, set the stage for reflection, a reckoning with hunger, defeat, and the unexpected ways in which survival reshapes perception, authority, and memory. War often defines itself through destruction, strategy, and heroism. But in the quiet aftermath, it is measured in smaller, subtler acts. A ration distributed, a body nourished, a mind recalibrated. For the German women in American POW camps, the brown paste of peanut butter was neither delicacy nor indulgence. It was survival made tangible. Its significance lay not in taste or novelty, but in its ability to restore strength, regulate the body, and remind the hungry that continuity, however imposed, was possible. The moment of consuming that paste transformed more than bodies. It reframed power. Authority had shifted from ideology to logistics. The side that could feed reliably had already assumed control. Hunger had dictated every choice, every movement, every thought for years. Now, it deferred to structure, rationing, and administrative rigor. The lesson was stark: war is fought not only with weapons, but with the precision of supply chains, the predictability of sustenance, and the quiet consistency of care. Yet there was also a moral and human dimension. The women's initial disbelief, cautious tasting, and eventual acceptance revealed the complex interplay of pride, shame, and gratitude. To survive under the gaze of those previously deemed enemies required recalibration, not of loyalty, but of expectation. The paste became more than nutrition, it became a medium through which defeat, endurance, and humanity intertwined. Survival was no longer heroic in the traditional sense. It was mundane, measured in calories and rhythms, yet profound in consequence. Historically, this episode illuminates the broader truth of the war's end. Victory is not solely about armies or territory, but about the restoration of life, the stabilization of routines, and the quiet affirmation of human dignity. The peanut butter tins, ordinary in the machinery of a global military, achieved extraordinary results. They reshaped perception, rebalanced power, and offered the first tangible promise of continuity in a continent hollowed by hunger and conflict. In the end, the story of these women and their brown paste reminds us that history is not only the record of battles and treaties, but of lived experience. It is in the small, intimate encounters between hunger and sustenance, fear and routine, body and mind, that the true weight of war and the fragile promise of peace is understood. In that realization, a quiet, human victory emerges: survival, endurance, and the profound resilience of ordinary life.